She called 911 on her own husband and he says she went too far. But wait until you hear what he did first. He ran into the house, locked his wife and 3 small children outside, and then she was the one who had to decide what to do next. 4 police cars pulled up in front of their home on a busy street, neighbors were doing U-turns just to watch, and her husband was furious at her. Not at himself. At her. Let that sink in for a moment. She made one phone call to keep her family safe, and somehow she ended up as the villain in his version of events. This story is not just about one phone call. It is about years of a pattern that quietly became her normal. She and her husband had been together long enough that the fights had a script. Not a random script. A very specific and calculated one. Things would escalate, she would start standing her ground, and then he would pivot. The moment he felt like he was losing control of the situation, out came the threat. He was going to hurt himself. He might not be here tomorrow. She had pushed him too far. And every single time, she would stop what she was doing, soften her position, and shift all of her focus to keeping him safe. The argument would dissolve. The original issue, whatever she had needed or asked for or objected to, would never get resolved. It would just disappear under the weight of his crisis, real or performed. Then, for the next several months, he would reference that moment as proof of how much damage she had caused him. She had nearly driven him to do something irreversible. That weight would sit on her shoulders like a debt she could never fully pay back. She would carry it into the next argument and the one after that, already half defeated before she even opened her mouth. And the cycle would start over. She had figured it out. Over years of watching this pattern repeat, she had come to understand what it actually was. It was a control tactic. Not a cry for help from someone genuinely struggling. A deliberate move designed to end the argument on his terms and remind her of what the cost of pushing back could be. She had friends and family who had actually died by suicide. She knew the specific texture of that kind of pain, the way it looks in someone's eyes, the way it sounds in their voice. She knew what real desperation looked like, and she also knew what this was. But knowing something intellectually and being able to act on that knowledge in the moment are 2 very different things. Because the one time she dismissed it and was wrong, the consequences would be unthinkable. So she stayed stuck, absorbing the threats and swallowing her own needs every time, because the alternative felt too dangerous. She had become the emotional hostage of a man who had learned that her compassion was the most reliable lock in the house. The day everything came to a head started with something painfully ordinary. They were driving somewhere and their autistic toddler was having a meltdown in the back seat. The kind of meltdown that fills a small car completely, sound bouncing off every surface, the child unable to regulate and everyone else struggling to stay steady. She told her husband to ease up on the child. That was it. That was the trigger. Not a grand accusation. Not a long-standing grievance finally surfacing. Just a mother asking a father to be gentler with their struggling kid in a difficult moment. He pulled the car over, got out, and started walking, waiting for her to chase after him and apologize. She had done it before. She knew the move intimately by now, could recognize it the way you recognize a song from the first 3 notes. He wanted her to come running, to beg, to reset the power balance back in his favor, to make him the center of the moment even while their child was falling apart in the back seat. This time she did not do it. She got into the driver's seat and kept going. That single act of not performing for him sent the whole situation into a spiral. He texted her that he was a danger to himself. She turned around. Of course she turned around. Because she is a human being with a conscience and with real grief from having lost people she loved. She felt the familiar cold drop in her stomach, that involuntary physical response that years of this pattern had trained into her body. She found him completely unharmed. He claimed he had attempted something. He had not. But she took him seriously anyway because that is who she is, and she drove him home. The ride home was its own nightmare. The children were still in the back seat. The movie was still playing on the screen above their heads, tinny audio filling the silence between the adults in the front. He told her he would hurt himself at home using a firearm they kept there. He told her if she did not take him home, he would call the police and say she was holding him against his will. He said these things quietly, almost calmly, in the way people speak when they want their words to land without any witnesses being able to point to a raised voice. 3 small children were in the back of that car watching a movie and trying not to notice what was happening in the front seats. She took him home because she was trying to protect those kids from witnessing something worse. She made a choice under extreme pressure with incomplete information and 3 little people depending on her to hold it together. The weight of that responsibility is almost impossible to describe from the outside. She had no good options. Every door she could see had something terrible behind it. Stay on the road with him making threats, and the children hear everything. Call for help on the roadside, and the children watch their father get detained or worse. Take him home, and she walks into an unknown. She chose the one that kept her children from seeing more than they already had. She was thinking about them even then, even in that moment of personal fear, even while he was sitting next to her issuing quiet ultimatums. That is who she was in this relationship, the one holding everyone together while being told it was never enough. When they got back, he ran inside and locked all of them out. All of them. His wife and his children, standing outside their own house, locked out by the man who was supposed to be their safe person. The kids were on the front step. She was on the front step. The door was locked. That was the moment she called 911. I need everyone to pause here for a second. He locked his own children out of the house and then complained about what happened next. 4 police cars came. Officers separated them and talked to them on the front lawn while the street filled up with the particular kind of neighborhood attention that daylight emergencies attract. Neighbors stepped onto porches. People slowed their cars. A few actually turned around to park and watch. She stood there answering questions as clearly and calmly as she could, knowing that every word she said was being evaluated by people who had never met her, who had no frame of reference for what the last several hours had looked like, who were trying to read a years-long situation in the space of a few minutes on a sunny afternoon. Her husband quickly switched into calm and composed mode, the way someone does when they have spent years learning exactly how to perform stability on demand. His voice would have been measured. His body language cooperative. He probably even seemed concerned, the picture of a reasonable man caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding. The police said they could not hold him because he seemed fine. And she stood there on her own front lawn, the summer air around her buzzing with the sound of radios and the awareness of being watched by people who had no idea what they were actually looking at, knowing that what the officers were seeing was a performance, and feeling completely powerless to explain years of context in a 5-minute conversation with a stranger in uniform. Now he was furious. The neighborhood had seen everything and was texting him about it. He told her she had ruined his reputation and added to his stress. His reputation. His stress. Think about what it takes to say that to someone. Think about the complete absence of reflection required to stand in front of your wife, after the afternoon she had just survived because of choices you made, and tell her that your primary concern is what the neighbors think of you. He was not asking if she was okay. He was not asking if the children were okay. He was not acknowledging any piece of what had unfolded. He went straight to his image and his comfort, because that is where his attention always lived. After he had spent the entire afternoon threatening his life, running away from a car containing his toddler mid-meltdown, making her chase him while 3 children sat in the back seat, locking his family out of their home, and threatening to call the police on her. After all of that, the thing he led with was that she had embarrassed him. This is the part that really gets to me. She was asking whether she had gone too far. That question alone tells you everything about what years of this kind of relationship does to a person. It tells you how completely her sense of her own judgment had been eroded. She had spent so long being told, directly and indirectly, that her reactions were the problem, that her responses were the cause of his pain, that her instincts could not be trusted, That she had genuinely lost the ability to read her own situation clearly. The gaslighting had done its work. She was sitting in the middle of an afternoon where she had been emotionally manipulated, physically separated from her home, threatened in front of her children, and left managing a crisis with small children watching. And her first instinct was to wonder if she was the one who had overreacted. Not him. Her. She had been so thoroughly trained to audit her own responses and second-guess her own instincts that even in a moment that clear, she still turned the lens on herself first. She mentioned that she knows she needs to leave. She is already working on it. She has spoken to a lawyer, connected with a family shelter, and told a family member what is happening. She is not someone who is waiting to be convinced or waiting for permission. She has already made the decision. Now she is building the conditions that make the exit survivable. She is doing this carefully because she is a stay-at-home mother with no independent income and a husband who has already demonstrated he will escalate unpredictably. The gun in the house is a factor that cannot be ignored. He is a former military service member with untreated post-traumatic stress disorder who is emotionally attached to that firearm. The combination of those two things, the instability and the access, changes the calculation entirely. She cannot just walk out the door the way someone might in a different situation. She has to think about timing, about documentation, about where the children will be, about how he is likely to respond when he understands that she is actually leaving and not just threatening to. She is navigating one of the most dangerous situations a person can face, which is leaving an abusive relationship where there is access to a weapon, and she is doing it with intention and support rather than impulse. That takes a level of courage that is hard to fully describe. The 911 call was not too far. It was the first time in years she responded to his tactics by refusing to absorb them alone. She stopped being the only line of defense between his threats and the rest of the world, and instead she put the responsibility where it belonged, into the hands of people trained to handle it. And the important thing to understand is that she did not make that call out of anger or revenge. She made it because she was standing on a front step with her children, locked out of her own house, after a man had just told her he intended to use a firearm on himself inside that house. She called because she had 3 children looking at her and no other reasonable move left to make. He did not like that. Of course he did not. Because the entire architecture of his control depended on her being the only one who knew. The moment there were witnesses, the moment there were records, the moment other people were watching, his power over the situation collapsed. And his anger was not about embarrassment. It was about the loss of leverage. She did not ruin his reputation. His behavior ruined his reputation. She just stopped hiding it. The verdict here is clear and it requires no softening. She was not wrong. She was not too far. She was years overdue. Every single person asking whether the woman in this story overreacted needs to go back and reread the part where her husband locked their children out of the house after threatening to use a firearm on himself. That is the moment this stopped being a domestic argument and became something that required outside intervention. She made the right call. The only call. And the fact that he came outside looking calm and collected for the officers is not evidence that there was no danger. It is evidence of how sophisticated the manipulation had become. He knew exactly how to perform normalcy when it served him. She needs to get that gun out of the house. That is the most pressing practical step and she already knows it. She needs to continue following the legal advice she is receiving and keep moving toward the exit with every resource available to her. What she does not need is to spend one more minute wondering if she went too far for protecting herself and her children. She went exactly as far as the situation required, and the man who is angry about it is angry because it worked. She took away his audience of 1 and replaced it with 4 police cars, and he has no idea what to do with a woman who stopped being afraid of his reaction. She called for help when she needed it. That is not a flaw. That is strength. Final word count, 2512. My coworker tried to steal my baseball tickets and then had the nerve to call me the problem. 2 baseball tickets. 2 seats behind the dugout at a Blue Jays game. 1 fair and square at a work Christmas party through a random draw. And somehow, before he even had a chance to figure out who he was going to bring, a coworker had already decided those tickets belonged to her. This one sounds small on paper. Tickets. A game. A workplace disagreement. But there is something about this story that is deeply familiar to anyone who has ever had something they earned treated like a resource someone else deserved more. And the audacity of how far this woman was willing to take it is what makes this whole thing worth talking about. He won the tickets at a Christmas party raffle. Random draw, various prizes, and he happened to pull the winning ticket for 2 seats at a Blue Jays game. Fantastic seats, apparently. The kind of seats that come from a vendor who splits a season pass with his brother and donates a couple of games to the party each year. These were not cheap consolation prizes. These were genuinely good tickets, and everyone at that party knew it, including his coworker who worked in the office and had full visibility into every gift that came in for the draw. She would have seen those tickets sitting there all evening, close enough to read the section and row number, close enough to know exactly what they were worth. She watched someone else win them. She smiled and clapped and then immediately started calculating. She wanted those tickets. She knew she had not won them. And she decided that did not matter. The moment he got them, she started her campaign. Her argument was that he did not watch baseball, he could not drive to Toronto, and therefore she would appreciate the tickets more than he would. Now, let us just sit with that logic for a moment. Since when does appreciation determine ownership of something that was randomly assigned? He might not be the world's biggest baseball fan, but he said yes to going. He invited his mother, a woman who rarely turns down the chance to spend time with her son, and they had a plan. Picture that for a second. A son calling his mother and telling her he had surprise tickets and she was the one he wanted to bring. That is not a small thing. That is a memory being made before anyone even set foot in the stadium. The tickets had a purpose. The tickets had sentimental value before the game even happened. None of that mattered to her. In her mind she had already decided he was an obstacle standing between her and something she deserved, and every warm or meaningful detail he could have offered was simply noise she was not interested in hearing. Over the next few months, she kept at it. Every chance she got, she was nudging him, suggesting he transfer the tickets over, acting as if his continued ownership of his own prize was somehow an ongoing negotiation. He stayed firm every time. But she did not stop. Each time he said no, she would wait a little while and then circle back with a slightly different angle, a new reason why it made more sense for her to have them, a new framing that positioned her desire as something reasonable and his refusal as something stubborn. She kept treating this like a conversation that was still open when he had already closed it, repeatedly and clearly. Imagine going to work every day knowing this was waiting for you. Knowing that at some unpredictable moment she would find a way to bring it up again, and that you would have to hold your ground again, calmly and firmly, over something that had already been decided months ago. That kind of slow, grinding persistence wears on a person even when they never give an inch. Okay, but calling the vendor directly. That took this to a completely different level. She called the vendor herself and told him that she was now the owner of the tickets. She did not ask. She stated it as a fact. She tried to go around the actual ticket holder entirely and manufacture a reality where the transfer had already happened. Think about the planning that required. She had to find the vendor's contact information, work out what she was going to say, and then make that call with full confidence while describing a transaction that had never occurred. The vendor, to his credit, sent her back to the person who actually owned the tickets. And then she walked out onto that factory floor and launched into a rant demanding he hand them over, as if the failure of her scheme was somehow his fault, as if the audacity it took to attempt what she had just attempted entitled her to be angry about how it ended. He told her no in terms that required no interpretation. She had crossed every reasonable line and he was done entertaining it. Whatever patience he had managed to hold on to over those months of polite refusals evaporated completely in that moment, and honestly nobody with a clear conscience could blame him for it. His buddy later told him he could have handled it better. And look, maybe the phrasing was blunt. Maybe there was a smoother way to end that conversation. But at some point, blunt is the only thing left when someone refuses to hear every polite version of the same answer. He said no for months. He explained himself. He held his ground. And she escalated to calling the vendor to fabricate a transfer that never happened. That is not a situation that gets resolved with a gentler tone. That is a situation that requires a very clear and final answer, which is exactly what he gave her. She was not acting out of genuine need. She was acting out of entitlement. There is a meaningful difference between someone who is struggling and asks for help and someone who decides that what you have should be hers because she wants it and has rationalized a reason why she deserves it more. She had access to all the gifts before the draw. She could see what was available. She did not win the draw. That is the end of the story. Everything after that point was her refusing to accept a fair and random outcome that did not go her way. And there is something particularly exhausting about that kind of person because they never experience themselves as the aggressor. In her own version of events, she was probably the reasonable one, the one who just wanted something she would have appreciated, dealing with a colleague who was being unnecessarily difficult. That level of self-insulation from accountability is almost impressive in how completely it shuts out reality. The edit at the end of his post is telling. He mentioned that his coworker is close with the human resources representative at his workplace and that he is currently looking for a new job because of that dynamic. That detail reframes the whole story. She was not just persistent and annoying. She was operating inside a web of workplace relationships that gave her a sense of protection and power. She knew that pushing him had fewer consequences for her than it would for someone without that connection. That is not just entitlement. That is entitlement backed by institutional cover. The kind of situation where the person doing the harm knows the system well enough to know it will not punish them, and so they push further than they ever would in a more neutral environment. And the fact that he felt forced to start job hunting because of someone who tried to take his raffle prize is genuinely infuriating. He did everything right. He won something fair and square, he stood his ground without escalating, he kept showing up to work and doing his job, and the consequence was that he had to start planning his exit because the person who behaved badly had better social infrastructure. He was not wrong. He was not even slightly wrong. He won something fairly, he made a plan for it, he said no clearly and consistently for months, and he only lost his patience after she bypassed him entirely and tried to deceive the original vendor into thinking a transfer had occurred. At that point, the social contract of polite workplace disagreement had already been broken, and she was the one who broke it. His reaction was a response to her escalation, not the origin of it. The verdict is simple. Keep the tickets. Go to the game. Enjoy every single inning with your mother and do not spend one moment of that day thinking about what your coworker would have done with those seats. You won them, you used them well, and you owed her absolutely nothing. The person who needs to reflect on their behavior in this situation is the one who called a vendor to lie about owning something she had never touched, and somehow still thought she was in the right. That is a level of self-justification that no amount of polite conversation was ever going to fix. Some stories are about big dramatic moments and some are about the quieter kind of disrespect, the kind that builds over months until someone finally says enough. Both of these people said enough. One just needed 4 police cars to make it stick. Drop a comment telling me which story hit harder for you, and if you are riding with this channel, a like and a subscribe genuinely means a lot.